It started with a seemingly innocent text, a message that flickered across my wife's phone screen one night while we were watching TV. I remember glancing over, expecting it to be from her mom or one of her friends, but instead, the name said, Martin. She quickly locked the phone, smiled at me awkwardly, and said it was just a work thing. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something in her eyes seemed off, like she was trying too hard to be normal. And that's when it began. The creeping doubt that gnawed at my mind like a splinter I couldn't pull out. My name's Dan, and for the past 10 years, I've been married to Amanda. We have what I thought was a pretty good life together. A modest house in a quiet neighborhood, 2 cats, and plenty of shared history that had always seemed enough to sustain us. But over the last few months, things had started to change. Amanda had grown distant, her laughter felt forced, and the warmth between us that used to be effortless had been replaced by something colder, something that made me feel more like a roommate than her husband. Then one night, I decided to do something I never thought I would do. I went through her phone while she was in the shower. It wasn't something I'm proud of, and I hated myself for even feeling the need to do it. But my gut was telling me that something was wrong, and when I opened her messages, I found it. A whole chain of texts between Amanda and this guy, Martin. They weren't just innocent work-related messages. They were flirtatious, intimate, and filled with inside jokes that I had no part of. My hands shook as I read through them, my chest tightening with every message. There were plans for drinks, plans for dinners. And then there was that one message, a single line that seemed to hit me harder than anything. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. My world collapsed in that moment. Amanda had cheated on me. Everything we'd built, all our shared memories, felt like they'd been set on fire. When she came out of the shower, I was still sitting there with her phone in my hands. I didn't say anything. I just looked at her, and she knew. Her face turned pale, her eyes wide with fear as she realized what I'd found. She tried to speak, tried to explain, but I couldn't listen, couldn't look at her. I got up, walked out of the room, and didn't stop until I was in my car, driving aimlessly, trying to make sense of how the woman I loved could betray me like this. Days passed and we barely spoke. I didn't know how to process it. Part of me wanted to leave, to pack my things and walk out for good. But then there was another part of me, the part that remembered all the good times, that still loved her despite everything. Amanda tried to apologize, tried to tell me it had just been a mistake, that it didn't mean anything. She swore that she wanted to make things right, to fix us. I didn't know if I believed her, but I also didn't know if I was ready to give up on everything we'd built. Then Martin showed up. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table staring blankly at a cup of coffee, Amanda walked in, her face pale and her eyes filled with fear. "Dan, we have a problem," she said, her voice trembling. She handed me her phone, and there it was, a message from Martin. He wanted money. He was threatening to tell everyone about the affair, to send photos and screenshots of their conversations to our families, our friends, even to my boss. He was blackmailing her, and now he was dragging me into it too. "Dan, I don't know what to do," she said, her voice breaking. "I never thought he would do something like this. He's threatening to ruin us." She was crying, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. And in that moment, despite everything, despite the betrayal and the anger, I felt something else. Fear. Fear that my entire life could be destroyed because of Amanda's mistake. Fear that everything I'd worked for could be torn apart because of this man. I knew we had to do something. We couldn't let Martin control us, couldn't let him hold this over our heads. But what could we do? He had the messages, he had the proof, and he was ruthless enough to use it. I looked at Amanda, her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something other than anger. I felt pity. She had made a terrible mistake, but now we were both paying the price. "Okay," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We're going to deal with this. Together." Amanda looked at me, her eyes searching my face as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "Together?" she whispered, her voice thick with tears. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure of what I was committing to. I just knew that I couldn't let this man destroy everything, no matter how angry I was with her. If we were going to get through this, we had to face it head on. First things first, I said, taking a deep breath. We need to understand what Martin wants and why. Does he have any leverage beyond those texts? Amanda wiped her eyes and shook her head, her lips trembling. I don't think so, she said, her voice breaking. He's been sending me these messages for a couple of weeks now. At first, he said he just wanted to keep seeing me, but when I told him it was over, he started making threats. I could feel my hands clenching into fists. This guy wasn't just an affair partner. He was manipulative, willing to use whatever power he could get. It made me sick to think of how easily Amanda had fallen into his trap. Still, focusing on my anger wouldn't help us now. We needed a plan. Did you ever meet him outside of hotels? I asked, my voice low. Amanda shook her head. No, it was only a couple of times, always in private. We were careful, but obviously not careful enough. She looked at me, her face twisted with guilt. I'm so sorry, Dan. I never meant for it to get this far. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice even. We can talk about that later, Amanda. Right now, we have to focus. Did he say how much money he wanted? She nodded, pulling up the messages on her phone. The demand was steep, $10,000 by the end of the week, or he'd start sending the screenshots to everyone we knew. It was enough to ruin both of us. Our families, our jobs, everything. My mind raced, trying to figure out the next move. We didn't have that kind of money just lying around, and even if we did, paying him would only be a temporary solution. If we gave him what he wanted now, what would stop him from coming back for more? No way, I said, shaking my head. We're not giving him anything. We can't let him think he has power over us. We have to find a way to get ahead of this. Amanda looked at me, a flicker of hope in her eyes. How? She asked. What can we do? I paused, thinking. We needed leverage of our own, something to make Martin back off. We have to gather information on him, I said, my voice taking on a new determination. If he's done this to us, maybe he's done it to other people too. Maybe he's got something to hide that we can use against him. Amanda nodded, her expression uncertain but willing. I don't know much about him, she admitted. He told me he was divorced, that he had a kid, but I never asked for details. We only met a few times, and it was all just, I don't even know why I did it. Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands again, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before putting a hand on her shoulder. I wasn't ready to forgive her. Not yet, maybe not ever, but we were in this together now, like it or not. Hey, I said softly, we'll figure it out. But you have to be strong, Amanda. We can't let him see us fall apart. We need to stay focused. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, and nodded. Okay, she whispered. I'll do whatever it takes. I promise. That night, we started digging. I made Amanda give me everything she knew about Martin. His last name, the places they'd met, anything that could help. It wasn't much, but it was a start. We combed through social media, trying to piece together his life from the fragments we could find. He was careful, but not careful enough. We found his Facebook profile, mostly private, but there were a few pictures of him with his kid, a boy who looked no older than 10. He had friends listed, a few posts about his hobbies, and eventually something that caught my attention. A post from a few years ago, tagging him in a picture with some other guys, all of them wearing uniforms from a local security company. Look at this, I said, pointing at the screen. Amanda leaned in, her eyes widening. He works for a security company? She asked, her voice shaky. I nodded. Maybe he still does. Something, at least. If we can figure out where he works, maybe we can find out more about him. It was a long shot, but it was the best we had. The more we knew about Martin, the more we could figure out how to stop him. We spent hours searching, trying to find anything that could give us an advantage. By the time we finally went to bed, the sun was beginning to rise, and we had little to show for our efforts besides exhaustion and frustration. But I wasn't giving up. Couldn't. This was our life on the line. Our marriage, our reputations, everything. And I was determined not to let this man take that from us. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache. the events of the past day crashing down on me like a tidal wave. Amanda was still asleep, curled up on her side of the bed, her face streaked with tears. It would have been so easy to blame her for all of this, to walk away and leave her to deal with the mess she had created. But there was something inside me that wouldn't let go. Despite everything she had done, I still loved her. It was a painful truth, one that I wasn't sure how to reconcile with the betrayal I felt. I made my way to the kitchen, the house still quiet in the early morning light. As I brewed a pot of coffee, I heard Amanda stir in the bedroom. She came out a few moments later, her eyes puffy and her hair disheveled. "Morning," she said, her voice small. I nodded, handing her a cup of coffee. We stood there for a moment, the silence thick with everything left unsaid. "We need to keep looking into Martin," I said, breaking the quiet. "We can't just let him control us like this." Amanda nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she took a sip of her coffee. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll help however I can." We decided to take a different approach that day. I remembered a friend of mine, Kevin, who worked in IT. If anyone could dig deeper into Martin's online presence, it would be him. I called him up, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what I needed. I didn't tell him everything, just that Amanda was being blackmailed by someone and that we needed to find out more about this guy. Kevin hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed to help. "I'll see what I can find," he said, his tone serious. "Give me a couple of hours." I thanked him, the weight of the situation pressing down on me as I hung up the phone. It was a risky move, involving someone else in this mess, but we needed help, and I trusted Kevin. He'd been my friend for years, and I knew he wouldn't ask too many questions. While we waited, Amanda and I sat in the living room, the tension between us palpable. She tried to start a conversation a few times, but I wasn't ready. Every time I looked at her, I saw the messages, the motel room, the way she had lied to me. It was hard to believe that the woman sitting across from me was the same one I had promised to spend my life with. A few hours later, my phone buzzed. It was Kevin. "Dan, I found something," he said, his voice cautious. "I don't know if it'll help, but I managed to pull some info on this guy, Martin." He sent me a link, and I clicked on it, my heart pounding. It led to an old news article, buried deep on a local news site. The headline made my stomach turn: "Local security guard arrested for assault." I read through the article, my eyes widening as I took in the details. It was from a few years ago, about an incident where Martin had been arrested after a bar fight. He'd gotten into an altercation with another man, and it had ended with Martin being taken away in handcuffs. The charges had been dropped, but the story painted a picture of a man with a short temper and a history of violence. "Is this the kind of guy who'd try to blackmail someone?" Kevin asked, his voice skeptical. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "Yeah," I said, my voice grim. "It is. Thanks, Kev. This helps more than you know." I hung up, turning to Amanda, who was watching me anxiously. I showed her the article and her face went pale. "Oh my God," she whispered, her eyes wide. "I didn't know. I mean, he never seemed like—" She trailed off, her voice breaking. I could see the fear in her eyes, and for the first time, I started to realize just how deep we were in. "This is leverage," I said, my voice firm. "He has a record. It may not be much, but it's something. If he wants to play dirty, we can too." Amanda nodded, her expression uncertain but hopeful. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking we need to meet with him," I said, my heart pounding as I spoke. "Face to face. We need to let him know that we won't be intimidated, that we have something on him too." Amanda's eyes widened in fear. "Are you sure that's a good idea, Dan? He's dangerous. What if he tries to hurt you?" I paused, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. Martin was dangerous, and meeting with him was a risk. But what choice did we have? We couldn't keep living in fear, waiting for the other shoe to drop. We had to take control of the situation. "I'll be careful," I said finally. "We'll pick a public place, somewhere he won't try anything. But we need to show him that we're not afraid. If he thinks we have leverage, he might back off." Amanda nodded, though I could see the doubt in her eyes. Okay, she said, her voice shaky. If you think it's the right thing to do, I'll trust you. We decided to message Martin, telling him that we wanted to meet. I used Amanda's phone, keeping the tone of the message calm but firm. I told him that we knew about his past, that we had no intention of giving him any money, and that we wanted to discuss things face to face. It was a gamble, but it was all we had. To my surprise, Martin agreed almost immediately. He sent back a time and place, a small diner on the edge of town that evening. I showed Amanda the message, and she looked at me, her face pale. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, though my heart was pounding. "We need to end this, Amanda," I said, "one way or another." The drive to the diner felt like it took hours, even though it was only a 30-minute trip. Amanda sat beside me in silence, her hands ringing nervously in her lap. I could feel the tension in the car, the air thick with everything unsaid. We both knew what was at stake tonight. If this didn't go as planned, our lives could be torn apart for good. As we pulled into the diner's parking lot, I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The diner was small, one of those old-fashioned places with flickering neon signs and big windows that allowed anyone driving by to see inside. It was a good choice, public, with plenty of witnesses. If things went sideways, at least we'd have people around. "Remember, we stick to the plan," I said, looking over at Amanda. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. "I understand," she whispered. I could see the fear in her eyes, but I also saw something else, determination. She wanted this nightmare to end as much as I did. We walked inside, the bell above the door jingling softly as we entered. My eyes scanned the room until I saw him, Martin. He was sitting at a booth near the back, his eyes locking onto us the moment we stepped in. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just stared at us with a look that made my skin crawl. He looked exactly like I imagined. A predator, someone who thrived off control and intimidation. Amanda and I approached the booth, sliding into the seats across from him. For a moment, there was silence, the tension between us almost unbearable. Martin leaned back, a smirk playing on his lips. "Amanda," he said, his voice smooth, "I was wondering when you'd come around. And you brought your husband. How sweet." I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my temper in check. This wasn't the time to let emotions take over. We needed to stay focused. I took a deep breath, leaning forward. "Cut the crap, Martin. You know why we're here. We're not giving you a dime," I said, my voice steady. Martin raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Really? Because from where I'm sitting, I have all the power. I think you'll find I can be very persuasive." He pulled out his phone, holding it up as if to taunt us. "You wouldn't want these messages getting out, would you?" Amanda flinched at his words, her eyes welling with tears. But I placed my hand over hers, squeezing gently. "We know about your past," I said, my voice cold. "The assault charges, the arrest. You're not as untouchable as you think. If you push us, we push back. And I don't think you want that kind of attention, do you?" For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in Martin's eyes. Uncertainty. He shifted slightly in his seat, his smirk faltering. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his tone darker now. "But you have no idea what I'm capable of. You think a few old charges are enough to scare me? Maybe not," I said, keeping my gaze locked on his. "But I doubt your employer would be too thrilled to find out what you've been up to. And I'm willing to bet the people in your life wouldn't be either. We're not just going to roll over and let you ruin us, Martin." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. The silence stretched, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, slowly, he leaned back, his eyes flicking to Amanda. "So, this is how it's going to be," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You two think you can bluff your way out of this?" I shook my head. "This isn't a bluff. We're done playing your game. You back off now, or we make sure everyone knows exactly who you are and what you've been doing." My voice was steady, each word laced with determination. I could feel Amanda trembling beside me, but I kept my eyes on Martin, refusing to back down. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze flicking between us. Then, to my surprise, he laughed. A low, bitter sound that made my skin crawl. "You know what?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you'd better pray you're right, because if I find out you're bluffing, you'll regret it." He stood up, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He looked down at Amanda, a cruel smile on his lips. "I guess this is goodbye, sweetheart," he said, his voice mocking. Amanda didn't respond. Her eyes locked on the table in front of her. Martin shook his head, then turned and walked out of the diner, the bell above the door jingling as he left. For a moment, I just sat there, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked over at Amanda, and she let out a shaky breath, her eyes filled with tears. "Do you think he'll leave us alone?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I took a deep breath, reaching over to take her hand. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we did everything we could. We stood up to him. That's more than we thought we could do a few days ago." Amanda nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm so sorry, Dan," she said, her voice breaking. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I know I've hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I don't want to lose you." I looked at her, my heart aching. It was hard to forget what she had done, hard to push past the betrayal. But as I looked into her eyes, I could see the regret, the pain, and the love that was still there, buried beneath all the mistakes. I didn't know if we could ever be the same, if I could ever truly trust her again. But I also knew that I wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy," I said, my voice quiet, "and I can't promise that everything will go back to the way it was. But I'm willing to try, if you are." Amanda nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I am," she whispered. "I want to fix this. I want to make things right." We sat there for a long moment, the weight of everything hanging between us. It wasn't a perfect ending, not by a long shot. There were still wounds that needed to heal, still a long road ahead of us. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. We had faced down the worst of it together, and maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward. The days following our confrontation with Martin were a blur. Amanda and I were walking on eggshells, both of us unsure of what to do next. We had forced Martin's hand, but we didn't know if that would be enough to make him disappear for good, or if he would come back with more threats. I found myself checking my phone constantly, expecting some sort of retaliation, but the messages never came. Every day that passed without hearing from him felt like a small victory, but there was still a gnawing sense of unease that I couldn't shake. It was like waiting for a bomb to go off, knowing it could happen at any moment but not knowing when. Despite the uncertainty, we were doing our best to put one foot in front of the other. Amanda tried her hardest to make amends. She was attentive in ways she hadn't been for months. Cooking dinner, asking about my day, staying off her phone when we were together. It was as though she was trying to prove to me in small ways that she was still here, still committed to us. But it was hard for me to accept. No matter how much I wanted to move forward, there was a part of me that couldn't forget. One afternoon, about a week after the diner, I got a call from Kevin. I stepped outside to take it, the sun warm on my face as I walked across the yard. "Hey, Dan," Kevin said, his voice a mix of curiosity and concern. "I've been thinking about what you told me, and I did a little more digging. I found something you might want to know." My heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Kevin paused for a moment before speaking. "It looks like Martin's in deeper trouble than we thought. He's got some debts, serious ones. From what I found, he's borrowed a lot of money from some shady people, and I'm guessing that's why he's so desperate. He's not just trying to ruin your life, he's trying to save his own." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. This information changed everything. Martin wasn't just after us for the thrill of control. He was desperate. He needed money to get himself out of a dangerous situation, and we had become his target. "Thanks, Kev," I said, my mind racing. "This helps more than you know." I hung up, staring out at the street as I tried to piece together what to do next. Knowing Martin's motivation gave us an edge, but it also made him more dangerous. A man with nothing to lose was capable of anything. When I went back inside, Amanda was in the kitchen, preparing lunch. She looked up when she saw me, her expression softening. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice cautious. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I talked to Kevin. He found out why Martin's been doing this," I said, and I explained what Kevin had told me. Amanda's face paled, her eyes widening as she listened. "So, he's in trouble? With dangerous people?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, and she put down the knife she was holding, her hands shaking. "Oh my God, Dan, what do we do? He's not going to just leave us alone, is he?" I took a deep breath, walking over to her and placing my hands on her shoulders. "We don't know that yet, but at least now we understand what's driving him. He's desperate, Amanda, and that makes him dangerous. But it also means he's scared. He's not as powerful as he wants us to believe." Amanda nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "I hate that I brought this into our lives. I'm so sorry, Dan. I wish I could take it all back." I looked at her, my heart aching. I knew she meant it, knew that she would take back every mistake if she could. But we couldn't undo what had been done. All we could do was move forward. "We can't change the past," I said softly, "but we can decide what we do next. We'll keep our guard up. We'll be careful. And we'll stay strong together." Amanda looked at me, her eyes searching my face for reassurance. Slowly, she nodded, taking a shaky breath. "Okay, together." That night, Amanda and I sat on the couch, side by side, as we tried to plan our next steps. We decided to document everything we had on Martin, the texts, the threats, the information Kevin had found. We didn't know if we would need it, but if Martin came after us again, we wanted to be prepared. It felt like a small step toward taking back control, a way of reminding ourselves that we weren't powerless. As the evening wore on, Amanda reached for my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine. "Dan," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "I know it's going to take time, but do you think we'll ever be okay again? Really okay?" I looked at her, my chest tightening at the vulnerability in her eyes. It was the question I had been asking myself every day since I found out about the affair. Could we ever truly heal from this? Could I ever truly trust her again? "I don't know," I admitted, my voice low, "but I want to try. I still love you, Amanda, and I think if we can get through this, maybe we can find a way to be okay again. Maybe even stronger." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she squeezed my hand. "I love you too," she whispered, "and I promise I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could come out of this stronger. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be days where the pain would feel like too much, where the doubt would creep back in. But as I sat there, holding Amanda's hand, I realized that I still wanted her by my side. Despite everything, I still wanted us. And that was enough for now. The following days felt like a test of our resolve. Every morning, I would wake up wondering if today would be the day that Martin decided to retaliate, if he would try to take things further. Amanda and I were cautious. We avoided talking about the situation in public, made sure our phones were secure, and stayed on guard for anything suspicious. The tension was a constant presence, always lingering beneath the surface of our attempts at normalcy. Amanda had taken a few days off work, and I was working from home as much as possible. We needed to be together, not just because of the threat of Martin, but because we were trying to rebuild the broken pieces of our relationship. It wasn't easy. There were moments where I wanted to lash out, to bring up the hurt, to ask her again how she could do this to us. But I knew that wouldn't help. The only way we could move forward was to choose forgiveness. And though it was hard, I was trying. Then, one afternoon, there was a knock on the door. Amanda and I both froze, exchanging a nervous glance. My mind immediately went to Martin. What if he had decided to confront us directly? I motioned for Amanda to stay back and approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I peered through the peephole and saw a man standing there. Someone I didn't recognize, wearing a plain suit. Slowly, I opened the door just a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice cautious. The man looked up, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Daniels?" he asked, and I nodded. He held up an ID, flashing it quickly. "My name is Detective Warren. I need to ask you a few questions about Martin Reynolds." The air seemed to leave the room all at once. A detective? My mind raced. I stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. Amanda appeared in the hallway, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice barely steady. Detective Warren stepped into the living room, his eyes briefly scanning the space before settling on us. "I understand that you two may have had some interactions with Martin Reynolds recently," he said, his tone professional. "We're currently investigating Mr. Reynolds in connection with several extortion attempts and other crimes. We believe he's been targeting multiple people for blackmail." I exchanged a look with Amanda, her face paling at the detective's words. "He's been trying to blackmail us?" I said, my voice filled with disbelief. "He threatened to send messages and photos to our friends and family if we didn't pay him. We didn't know he was involved in anything else." Detective Warren nodded, taking out a small notebook. "We've received similar reports from others. It seems Mr. Reynolds has been trying to use his knowledge of people's personal lives to extort money from them. I need you to tell me everything. When he contacted you, what he said, how you responded." Amanda and I sat down with the detective, recounting everything that had happened over the past few weeks. I could see Amanda trembling beside me, her voice shaky as she described her initial interactions with Martin and how things had spiraled out of control. I filled in the rest, telling him about the confrontation at the diner, our research into Martin's background, and the information Kevin had found about his debts. The detective listened carefully, jotting down notes as we spoke. When we were finished, he looked up, his expression softening slightly. "I understand that this has been a difficult time for both of you," he said. "Martin Reynolds has been under investigation for a while now, but we haven't had enough evidence to charge him. Your testimony could be crucial in building a case against him." Amanda looked at me, her eyes wide. "Does that mean he could be arrested?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and fear. The detective nodded. "If we can gather enough evidence to support the extortion charges, yes. But I need you both to understand that this might not be immediate. People like Reynolds tend to be slippery, they know how to cover their tracks. But your cooperation helps, and it could lead to stopping him." The detective handed us his card, his expression serious. "If he contacts you again, or if you notice anything suspicious, I need you to call me immediately. We're doing everything we can to bring him in, but in the meantime, I want you both to stay vigilant." We thanked him as he left, and once the door closed behind him, Amanda let out a shaky breath, collapsing onto the couch. "Oh my God, Dan," she whispered. "Do you think this could really be over? Do you think they can stop him?" I sat down beside her, my mind reeling from everything that had just happened. "I hope so," I said, my voice quiet. "At least now we know we're not alone. There are people out there who are trying to help us, who want to see him stopped." Amanda nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I've been so scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Scared that he'd come after us again, that I'd destroyed everything between us. But now, maybe there's a chance we can move on." I reached out, taking her hand in mine. "It's going to take time, Amanda, but we're doing everything we can. We're facing this together, and we're not letting him win." We sat there for a long time, holding on to each other, letting the hope sink in. The fear wasn't gone, not entirely. We knew that there was still a chance that Martin could try something else, that the investigation might drag on. But for the first time, we felt like we had a real chance to fight back. It was a small glimmer of light at the end of a very dark tunnel, but it was enough. That night, Amanda and I went to bed feeling a sense of peace we hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from knowing everything was fixed. It was the peace of knowing that we were still standing, that we were still together despite everything. And maybe that was what mattered most. As I lay there, Amanda's head resting on my shoulder, I found myself thinking about the future. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be days where the hurt and the anger resurfaced. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we could face it, like we could keep moving forward one day at a time. Weeks passed, and the tension that had gripped our lives slowly began to ease. Detective Warren stayed in contact, updating us on the investigation. The authorities were working to build a case against Martin, and though it wasn't an overnight process, each call brought a little more hope, knowing that Martin was being watched, that his reign of manipulation might finally come to an end, helped us both breathe a little easier. Amanda and I were doing our best to put the pieces of our relationship back together. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when the pain of her betrayal would hit me out of nowhere, the memories of the texts and the motel flashing in my mind. But I was trying to let go of the bitterness, to replace it with understanding and empathy. We had chosen to stay together, and that meant choosing to heal even if it wasn't always simple or straightforward. Amanda was putting in the effort. She went to therapy not just for us but for herself. She was trying to understand why she had made those choices, why she had let things get so far. I could see the change in her. The way she was more open, more vulnerable, more willing to admit her flaws and take responsibility. And that helped me, too. It helped me see that she wasn't the same person who had made those mistakes, that she was trying, just as I was, to be better. One Saturday morning, we decided to go for a hike, something we used to do all the time before everything fell apart. It was a small step toward reclaiming the life we had lost, a way to remind ourselves of the simple joys we used to share. We drove out to a nearby trail, the sky clear and the air crisp as we set off into the woods. The hike was quiet at first, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the occasional rustle of birds in the trees. But it was a comfortable silence, one that didn't feel heavy or forced. As we walked, Amanda reached for my hand, her fingers brushing against mine hesitantly, as if she was unsure if I would pull away. I didn't. I laced my fingers with hers, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with emotion, and I gave her a small smile. "I know it's still hard," she said softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "I know I hurt you, Dan, and I don't think I'll ever be able to make up for that. But I'm so grateful that you're still here, that you're still willing to try." I stopped, turning to face her. Her eyes were glistening with tears, her face filled with raw vulnerability. I could see the guilt there, but also the hope that we could move forward, that we could build something stronger from the ashes. I took a deep breath, my heart heavy with everything I wanted to say. "It is hard," I said, my voice low. "There are days when I still struggle to understand why it happened, when the pain is still there. But I'm trying to move past it because I love you, Amanda. And I see how hard you're working to make things right. I know it's not going to be easy, but I want to believe that we can make it through this." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she nodded, her lips trembling as she tried to smile. "I love you too," she whispered, "more than anything. And I promise, I will never take that for granted again." We stood there for a moment, the wind rustling through the trees around us, the sunlight filtering through the leaves in golden beams. It wasn't perfect. There was still pain, still uncertainty. But there was also love, a love that had been tested and had survived, a love that was willing to fight for a second chance. We continued our hike, the conversation turning lighter as we walked deeper into the woods. We talked about the little things, the way the leaves were beginning to change color, the plans we had for the week, the things that made us laugh. It felt like a glimpse of the life we used to have, and it gave me hope that we could find our way back to that place again. As we reached the top of the trail, the view spread out before us. A sea of trees stretching out to the horizon, the city skyline visible in the distance. Amanda let out a soft sigh, her eyes shining as she looked at the beauty around us. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice filled with awe. I looked at her, seeing the way her eyes sparkled, the way her lips curved into a genuine smile. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from forgetting the past, but the kind that came from accepting it, from choosing to move forward in spite of everything that had happened. "Yeah," I said, my voice soft. "It really is." We stood there, side by side, looking out at the world in front of us. It wasn't the end of our journey, not by a long shot. There would still be challenges, still days when the hurt would resurface, when the doubts would creep in. But as I stood there with Amanda, I realized that I wanted to keep moving forward. I wanted to keep trying, to keep building a life with her, even if it wasn't perfect. Because love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other, even when it's hard. It's about forgiveness, about growth, about being willing to face the darkest parts of each other and still choosing to stay. And that was what I wanted. For better or worse, I wanted to stay. We made our way back down the trail, hand in hand, the sunlight warming our faces. It wasn't a happy ending because life isn't a fairy tale. But it was a beginning, a new chapter in our story, one that we were writing together, one day at a time. And for now, that was enough.